Sometimes a man reaches a point where he's got nothing left but hope and the clothes on his back. Bo Stoddard knew that feeling all too well when he spent his last $20 on a cabin he'd never even seen. The folks in Cedar Falls laughed at him, said he'd bought himself a pile of rotten wood and mouse nests. But Bo needed shelter more than he needed their approval. When he finally opened that weathered door, he found decades of junk piled high. Old packs, rusted tools, and forgotten belongings filled every corner. Then he started finding things that didn't belong. A Civil War journal wrapped in wax, Union coins from 1863, a hand-drawn map marking gold veins in red ink. The cabin's previous owner wasn't just any man. He was a scout who'd vanished 40 years ago. What was he really hiding up in those mountains? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Bo Stoddard had been walking a hard road for more years than he cared to count. 53 winters had weathered his face like old leather, and each one had taken something from him. First the ranch in Colorado, lost to drought and debt when cattle prices dropped through the floor. Then his wife, Sarah, taken by consumption that winter when the medicine money went to feed the stock instead. Their boy Tommy had lit out for California the day after they buried her, and Bo couldn't find it in his heart to blame him. That was 8 years back. Since then, Bo had drifted from job to job, ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to call any place home. His hands were still strong, his back still straight, but the fire in his belly had dimmed to barely glowing embers. He'd worked cattle drives, mended fences, broken horses for other men's dreams, while his own turned to dust. Cedar Falls wasn't much to look at, just a handful of weathered buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud when it rained. The kind of town where strangers were noticed and remembered, where everybody knew everybody else's business, whether they wanted to or not. Bo had ridden in 3 days ago with $37 to his name and a horse that was getting too old for the work. Just like his rider, the general store occupied the corner of Main and Cedar Street, its false front painted a faded blue that had once been cheerful. Martha Henley ran the place with the efficiency of a woman who'd learned to make every penny count. She was somewhere past 40, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. When Bo first walked through her door, she'd sized him up in about 3 seconds and known exactly what kind of man he was. The drifting kind, looking for work or shelter or both. "You're not from around here," she'd said. Not unkindly, but matter of fact. "No, ma'am. Just passing through looking for work if there's any to be had." Martha had studied him over the counter, taking in the worn but clean clothes, the respectful manner, the way he kept his hat in his hands. "Cattle work?" "Yes, ma'am." "Horses, too?" "Most anything that needs doing." She'd nodded slowly. "Doc Brennan might have something. His place is the White House with the green shutters 2 blocks down. Tell him Martha sent you." Doc Brennan turned out to be a thin, scholarly man in his 60s who'd come west for his health 20 years ago and stayed for the peace. He needed someone to tend his small herd of horses and do odd jobs around his property. The pay wasn't much, but it included a spot in the barn loft and 2 meals a day. Bo had been grateful for the arrangement until the drifter showed up. The man had appeared at Doc's place just after sunset on Bo's second day, leading a pack mule and riding a horse that had seen better years. He was probably 60, with a beard gone white and eyes the color of winter sky. He moved like someone carrying a great weariness, and when he spoke, his voice held the rasp of a man who'd spent too many nights sleeping rough. "Name's Jake Morrison," he'd said when Doc invited him to step down and rest a spell. "I'm heading south, but this old horse needs a day's rest. I can pay for feed and a spot to bed down." Doc had been hospitable, as was his nature, offering the man dinner and a place by the fire. It was over coffee that the conversation had taken an interesting turn. "I don't suppose either of you gentlemen knows anything about the old cabin up on Widow's Ridge?" Morrison had asked, seemingly casual. "Belonged to a fellow named Samuel Cross, I believe." Doc had frowned thoughtfully. "Cross? Can't say I recall the name." "The cabin's been empty for years, though. Folks say it's full of junk." "Well," Morrison had said with a slight smile, One man's junk is another man's treasure, as they say. I'd be interested in purchasing it if it's for sale. That's when Doc had looked at Bo, with something approaching sympathy. I'm afraid you're a day too late, friend. This fellow here just bought the place yesterday. The change in Morrison's expression had been subtle but unmistakable. His eyes had sharpened, focusing on Bo with sudden intensity. Is that so? Might I ask what you paid for it? Bo had felt uncomfortable under that gaze, but he'd answered honestly. $20. Bought it from a fellow passing through. Never even seen the place myself. Morrison had chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. $20 for the cross place. Well, I'd say you got yourself quite a bargain. Quite a bargain indeed. The next morning, Morrison had saddled up and ridden out before dawn, but not before leaving Bo with a piece of advice that felt more like a warning. Be careful what you dig up in that old cabin, friend. Sometimes the past is better left buried. Now, as Bo guided his horse up the winding trail to Widow's Ridge, Morrison's words echoed in his mind. The path was overgrown, but still passable, winding through stands of pine and aspen that grew thicker as he climbed. The air was thin and sharp with the promise of early snow, and his breath made small clouds in the crisp morning light. The cabin sat in a clearing about halfway up the ridge, surrounded by tall pines that swayed gently in the mountain breeze. It was larger than Bo had expected, not grand, but solidly built of hewn logs that had weathered to a silver grey. The roof sagged slightly, but appeared intact, and the single stone chimney rose straight and true against the sky. Bo dismounted and tied his horse to a sturdy pine, then approached the cabin slowly. The door was heavy wood, weathered but solid, with an old iron latch that moved smoothly when he lifted it. The hinges groaned as the door swung open, releasing the musty smell of closed spaces and old things. The interior was dim, lit only by weak sunlight filtering through two small windows. As his eyes adjusted, Bo began to make out the shapes that filled the single large room. There were wooden crates stacked against one wall, canvas packs hanging from pegs, tools and equipment scattered on rough-hewn shelves. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, with a heavy wooden table and two chairs positioned nearby. But it was the sheer volume of accumulated belongings that struck him most. This wasn't the random collection of a pack rat. There was an organization to it, a purpose that spoke of a methodical mind. Someone had lived here and worked here, and whatever that work had been, it had required a considerable amount of equipment. Bo moved deeper into the cabin, picking his way carefully between the obstacles. Near the fireplace he found a trunk made of dark wood, its brass fittings green with age. The lid was heavy, but opened easily, revealing layers of carefully packed items wrapped in oiled cloth. The first thing he unwrapped was a book, a journal bound in worn leather, its pages yellowed with age. The cover bore no title, but when Bo opened it, he found page after page of neat handwriting in faded black ink. The first entry was dated September 15th, 1883, and began with the words, "The trail grows cold, but Cross does not give up easily." Bo's pulse quickened as he read further. The journal belonged to Samuel Cross, and it was clear from the early entries that Cross was no ordinary mountain man. He wrote with the precision of an educated man and the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. There were detailed observations about terrain, weather patterns, and most intriguingly, references to the objective and completion of the mission. As Bo continued reading, a picture began to emerge of a man on a specific quest. Cross wrote about following trails, interviewing locals, and searching for signs of something or someone that remained frustratingly vague in the early entries. But gradually, the purpose of his search became clearer. October 3rd, 1883. The local sheriff confirms what I suspected. The Mason gang did indeed pass through this territory in late summer of 1865. 3 men, 2 pack animals, heading north toward the mining camps. If my calculations are correct, they would have been carrying the entire contents of the Virginia City bank robbery, including the Union gold shipment that was being held there pending transport to Denver. Bo set the journal down for a moment, his mind racing. A bank robbery. Union Gold. This wasn't just any treasure hunt. This was official business. The kind that brought federal marshals and military investigators to small mountain towns. He turned to the next entry, dated a week later, October 10th, 1883, found the remains of their camp 12 miles north of Cedar Falls. The ashes were old, but I discovered this carved into a pine tree, a crude map showing the location of what appears to be a cache. If this is genuine, the Mason gang buried their loot somewhere in the vicinity of Widow's Ridge before meeting their end. The local Indian tribes speak of 3 white men found dead near Devil's Canyon in the autumn of 1865, killed by a rock slide while trying to escape pursuing cavalry. If these were indeed the Mason brothers, their treasure may still be hidden somewhere on this mountain. Beau's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. Here was a man who had spent months, perhaps years, methodically tracking down a lost fortune. And if Cross had been successful in his search, then somewhere in this cabin or on this mountain lay gold that had been missing for nearly 40 years. The journal entries continued through the autumn and winter of 1883, chronicling Cross's systematic search of the ridge. He had been thorough, mapping every gulch and canyon, marking possible hiding spots, following up on every lead and rumor. The final entry was dated March 20th, 1884. The last of the winter storms have passed, and I can finally reach the upper reaches of the ridge. Tomorrow, I investigate the cave system near Devil's Point. If my calculations are correct, this is where the Mason gang would have hidden their cache before attempting to escape over the pass. After 6 months of searching, I believe I am finally close to completing my mission. There were no more entries after that date. Beau closed the journal and sat back in the dusty chair, his mind spinning with the implications of what he'd just read. Samuel Cross had been a treasure hunter, but not the usual kind. He'd been methodical, professional, working with official backing to recover stolen government gold. And then he had simply vanished, leaving behind all his research and equipment. The wind picked up outside, rattling the cabin's windows and sending a shower of pine needles across the roof. Beau realized the sun was getting low and he needed to head back to town before dark. But as he carefully rewrapped the journal and closed the trunk, he knew his life had just taken another unexpected turn. For the first time in years, Stoddard had something to hope for. Beau rode back to town through the gathering dusk, with Cross's journal wrapped carefully in his saddlebags. His mind churned with questions that multiplied faster than he could process them. A federal treasure hunt. Stolen Union gold. A man who had vanished at the moment of discovery. Each revelation felt like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting 40 years for someone to put them together. The next morning, Beau found himself standing outside Martha Henley's general store before she'd even turned the sign from closed to open. When she unlocked the door and saw him waiting, she raised an eyebrow but stepped aside to let him enter. "You're up early for a man who's supposed to be tending Doc's horses," she observed, moving behind the counter with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd opened this store every morning for the past 15 years. "Yes, ma'am. I was wondering if you might know anything about a fellow named Samuel Cross. Would have lived up on Widow's Ridge, maybe 20 years back or so." Martha's hands stilled as she was arranging a display of patent medicines. She turned to face him fully, her expression suddenly guarded. "Now that's an interesting question. What's got you asking about Sam Cross?" The fact that she knew the name immediately told Beau he was on the right track. "Found some of his belongings in the cabin. Thought I might learn something about the man who lived there before me." "Sam Cross," Martha shook her head slowly. "Now there was a curious fellow. Showed up in town around 1883, maybe 84. Quiet type, always polite, but he had a way of asking questions that made folks uncomfortable. Wanted to know about old-timers, people who'd been here during the war years. Said he was writing a book about the territory's history, what happened to him. Nobody rightly knows. One day he just stopped coming to town. Folks figured he'd moved on, the way drifters do. When spring came and he still hadn't been seen, a few men rode up to check on him. Found the cabin empty but not cleaned out, like he'd just stepped away for a few minutes and never came back. Bo absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with what he'd read in the journal. Did anyone ever search for him? Some. Sheriff organized a party to check the upper ridges in case he'd had an accident. Never found so much as a boot print. Martha studied Bo's face carefully. Of course, that was near 20 years ago now. Why the sudden interest in ancient history? Before Bo could answer, the store's bell jingled as the door opened. Both Bo and Martha turned to see a man enter, not Jake Morrison, but someone who carried himself with the same careful alertness. He was younger than Morrison, perhaps 40, with dark hair and clothes that marked him as someone from outside the territory. "Morning, folks," the stranger said pleasantly. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," Martha replied, though Bo noticed her tone had become more formal. "What can I do for you?" "Well, I'm hoping you might be able to help me locate someone. I'm looking for a gentleman named Morrison, Jake Morrison. Older fellow, white beard, travels with a pack mule. I was told he might have passed through here recently." Bo felt his stomach tighten. This was no coincidence. Morrison. Martha pretended to consider. "Can't say I recall the name. We get a fair number of travelers through here, though." "What's your business with him?" The stranger smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Family matter. His sister's been worried about him, hasn't heard from him in months. I'm hoping to catch up with him and let him know she's doing well." It was smoothly delivered. But Bo caught the slight hesitation before sisters. He also noticed that the man's clothes, while travel-worn, were of better quality than most drifters could afford. His boots were good leather, recently oiled, and his gun belt showed the kind of care that spoke of professional use. "Well," Martha said carefully, "if I see anyone by that name, I'll certainly let him know you're looking for him." "What should I tell him your name is?" "Smith, John Smith." The stranger's smile widened slightly, acknowledging the obviousness of the alias. "I'll be staying at the hotel for a few days if he turns up." After the man left, Martha turned to Bo with troubled eyes. "That fellow's no more related to Jake Morrison than I am. And Jake Morrison's no more a drifter than that one is named Smith." Bo nodded grimly. "Morrison was asking about the cross cabin. Seemed mighty interested when he learned I'd bought it. And now someone's tracking Morrison." Martha moved to the window and watched the stranger cross the street toward the hotel. "Bo, I think you might have stumbled into something bigger than an old treasure story." That afternoon, Bo rode back up to the cabin with a sense of urgency he couldn't quite explain. The journal had revealed Cross's mission, but there had to be more. Professional treasure hunters didn't vanish without leaving some record of their discoveries, especially men as methodical as Cross appeared to be. He spent the remainder of the day conducting a more systematic search of the cabin. In the wooden crate beneath the window, he found surveying equipment, a transit, measuring chains, and detailed topographical maps of the region, marked with Cross's careful notations. Another trunk yielded correspondence that made Bo's pulse quicken. The letters were official, bearing the letterhead of the United States Marshal Service, District of Colorado. They were addressed to S. Cross, Special Deputy, and signed by Marshal William Hayes. The earliest was dated August 15th, 1883, Deputy. "Cross, your assignment to investigate the Mason gang robbery of 1865 is hereby confirmed. As discussed, the recovery of the stolen Union gold shipment remains a federal priority. You are authorized to use whatever resources necessary to locate and secure the missing funds. Regular reports are expected monthly until the matter is resolved." Bo's hands shook slightly as he read. Cross hadn't been a freelance treasure hunter. He'd been a federal deputy marshal on official assignment. The implications hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just about lost gold anymore. This was about a federal investigation that had never been closed. The subsequent letters tracked Cross's progress through the autumn and winter of 1883. His reports were professional and detailed, chronicling his interviews with locals, his analysis of historical records, and his growing certainty that the Mason gang's cash was hidden somewhere on Widow's Ridge. The final letter was different from the others. It was dated March 18th, 1884, just 2 days before Cross's last journal entry. Marshal Hayes, "I have located what I believe to be the Mason gang's primary cache. The site matches historical accounts, and physical evidence confirms recent excavation, though not by the original perpetrators. Someone has been here before me, but based on the limited scope of their dig, I believe they recovered only a portion of the hidden gold. My investigation suggests the main cache remains intact. I will conduct final verification tomorrow and report my findings immediately upon confirmation. S. Cross. Special Deputy. There was no follow-up letter. Bo sat back on his heels, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Cross had found the treasure, or at least part of it, but something had happened before he could report back to his superiors. And now, 40 years later, people were still looking for both Cross and whatever he had discovered. The sound of approaching horses jolted Bo from his thoughts. Through the cabin's window, he could see two riders coming up the trail in the gathering dusk. Even at a distance, he recognized one of them as the man who'd called himself John Smith. Bo quickly gathered the marshal's letters and stuffed them into his jacket, along with Cross's journal. Whatever was about to happen, he didn't want these documents falling into the wrong hands. He checked his revolver, an old Colt that had seen better days, but still shot straight, and positioned himself where he could. Watch the approaching riders without being easily seen. The men stopped about 50 yards from the cabin and dismounted. Smith gestured toward the building while speaking in low tones to his companion. Bo couldn't make out the words, but their body language spoke of men conducting business they didn't want observed. After a few minutes of discussion, both men remounted and rode back down the trail. But Bo noticed that Smith's companion continued past the main path, disappearing into the trees to the north. They were setting up a watch on the cabin. As full darkness settled over the ridge, Bo realized his situation had become considerably more dangerous. Whatever Jake Morrison had been looking for, these men wanted it badly enough to track him down and stake out the cabin. And now Bo was caught in the middle of something that had begun 20 years before he was born. He settled down to wait for dawn, Cross's documents secure in his jacket and his hand never far from his gun. For the first time since buying the cabin, Bo wondered if maybe the folks in Cedar Falls had been right about one thing. Sometimes a man really could pay too much for a pile of old junk. But as he thought about Cross's methodical search and that final, tantalizing report about a discovered cache, Bo knew there was no turning back now. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to run or to finish what Samuel Cross had started. Bo spent a restless night in the cabin, dozing fitfully in the wooden chair by the cold fireplace. Every sound from the forest, the crack of a branch, the rustle of wind through pine needles, the distant call of an owl, brought him instantly alert. Through the small window, he could occasionally glimpse the faint glow of what he assumed was a campfire somewhere in the trees to the north. As the first grey light of dawn crept across the ridge, Bo made his decision. Running would solve nothing, and these men clearly weren't going away on their own. If he was going to survive this situation, he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with. That meant finding whatever Cross had discovered and learning why it was still worth killing for after 20 years. He slipped out the cabin's back window just as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, moving carefully through the pine trees that provided cover between the cabin and the upper ridges. His years of ranch work had taught him to move quietly through rough country, and the soft pine needles muffled his footsteps as he made his way up the mountain. The terrain grew rougher as he climbed, with exposed granite outcroppings and scattered boulders providing natural hiding spots. Bo found himself breathing hard in the thin air, but he pushed on, following what appeared to be an old game trail that wound its way toward the highest point of the ridge. About a mile above the cabin, he discovered the first sign that Cross had been here before him. Carved into the bark of a large pine was a series of symbols, not random scratches, but deliberate markings that meant something to someone who knew how to read them. Bo copied the symbols into the margin of Cross's journal, then continued climbing. The trail led to a natural shelf of rock that offered a commanding view of the valley below. From this vantage point, Bo could see the cabin, the main trail to town, and more importantly, the camp where Smith and his companion had spent the night. 2 men, 2 horses, and what looked like enough supplies for an extended stay, but it was what he found hidden beneath an overhang of granite that made his pulse quicken. Someone had built a small shelter here, just large enough for 1 man and his essential equipment. The construction was professional, designed to be invisible from below while providing protection from the weather. This had been Cross's base camp during his final search. Inside the shelter, wrapped in oiled canvas and wedged into a crack in the rock, Bo found Cross's field notes from his last weeks on the mountain. These were different from the formal journal entries, hastily scrawled observations and sketches that revealed the intensity of a man close to achieving his goal. March 15th. Located the primary excavation site. Mason gang definitely cached major portion here, but site shows evidence of partial recovery. Estimate 60–70% of original cache remains. Local folklore suggests cave system extends deeper than initially mapped. March 17th, breakthrough. Found Mason gang marker stone indicating secondary cache. Original robbery yielded more than federal records indicate. Gang split treasure between 2 sites for security. Main site compromised, but secondary location appears intact. March 19th, secondary site confirmed. Cave entrance concealed but accessible. Interior shows no signs of disturbance. Tomorrow we'll conduct full survey and recovery. The final entry was written in a shaky hand, as if Cross had been under stress or working by poor light. March 20th. They know. Morrison and his men have been tracking my progress. Must secure the cache before they arrive. If something happens to me, the entrance is marked according to the old Spanish method. 3 stones forming a triangle, pointing toward the hidden door. Tell Hayes the Confederates never got their gold back. Bo's blood ran cold as he read the last entry. Morrison, the same Jake Morrison who had appeared at Doc Brennan's place asking about the cabin. Cross had known he was being hunted, and his pursuers had found him before he could complete his mission or report back to his superiors. The field notes included detailed sketches of the surrounding terrain, with careful measurements and compass bearings. Cross had been methodical even under pressure, leaving a clear trail for someone else to follow. The sketches showed the location of both the primary excavation site and the concealed entrance to what Cross called the secondary cache. Bo studied the drawings carefully, comparing them to the landscape around him. If Cross's measurements were accurate, the secondary cache was less than half a mile from his current position, hidden somewhere in the limestone cave system that honeycombed this part of the mountain. The sound of voices from below made Bo freeze. Through the pine trees, he could see Smith and his companion breaking camp. They were preparing to move, and from their gestures and the direction they were looking, it was clear they intended to search the upper ridges. Bo quickly rewrapped Cross's field notes and secured them in his jacket alongside the journal and Marshall's correspondence. Whatever advantage he had gained by finding Cross's base camp would be lost if these men caught him up here. He needed to get back to the cabin and decide on his next move. The descent proved more treacherous than the climb. Bo had to move quickly while remaining quiet, and the loose shale and exposed roots made for uncertain footing. Twice he nearly lost his balance on steep sections, catching himself just in time to avoid a fall that would have announced his presence to anyone within a mile. He reached the cabin just as Smith and his companion were approaching from the main trail. Bo slipped through the back window and positioned himself, where he could observe their movements while appearing to be conducting normal morning activities. The 2 men dismounted about 30 yards from the cabin. Smith approached the door while his companion, a lean, hard-faced man who wore his gun like he knew how to use it, took a position that allowed him to watch both the cabin and the surrounding trees. "Stoddard," Smith called out. "We need to talk." Bo opened the door slowly, keeping his hands visible but ready to draw if necessary. "Morning, gentlemen. You're on my property." Smith smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Your property?" "Yes, about that. I think there's been a misunderstanding about what exactly you purchased. Seems clear enough to me. Cabin and everything in it. Everything in it. Smith nodded thoughtfully. That's the problem, you see. Some of what's in there doesn't belong to the previous owner. Some of it belongs to people who are very interested in getting it back. Bo stepped fully outside, closing the door behind him. Such as? Such as certain documents that relate to federal investigations. Documents that could cause problems for everyone involved if they fell into the wrong hands. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. These men knew about Cross's official status, and they were offering Bo a way out that didn't involve violence. Yet, I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, Bo replied carefully. Found some old books and papers, but nothing that seemed important enough to interest federal investigators. Smith's companion shifted slightly, his hand moving closer to his weapon. The negotiation phase was ending. Mr. Stoddard, Smith said quietly, I'm going to give you one chance to avoid a great deal of unpleasantness. Turn over any documents you found relating to Samuel Cross. Tell us everything Cross recorded about his search, and ride away from here with enough money to start over somewhere else. And if I don't? Smith's smile faded completely. Then we'll take what we need, and you won't be riding anywhere at all. Bo felt the familiar weight of his Colt against his hip and calculated the distance between himself and the nearest cover. 2 against 1, but he had the advantage of knowing the ground. The question was whether he was still fast enough to make it count. The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds, though it felt like an hour to Bo. 3 men with guns, each calculating angles and distances, weighing survival against the cost of violence. In the end, it was the sound of approaching horses that broke the spell. Smith's companion cursed under his breath and gestured toward the main trail. Company coming! Through the trees, Bo could see a small party of riders making their way up toward the cabin. Even at a distance, he recognized the purposeful way they moved. This wasn't a casual visit. Smith and his partner exchanged a quick look before Smith called out to Bo. This conversation isn't finished, Stoddard. But it seems we'll have to continue it later. The 2 men mounted quickly and rode north into the timber, disappearing just as the approaching party came into view. Bo felt a surge of relief when he recognized Doc Brennan in the lead, accompanied by Martha Henley and 2 men Bo didn't know, but who carried themselves like law enforcement. Doc dismounted first, his weathered face creased with concern. Bo, thank God you're all right. We saw those 2 riding hard away from here as we came up the trail. Who were they? Asked one of the strangers, a stocky man with a badge pinned to his vest. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to asking questions and getting answers. Sheriff Tom Crawford, Doc explained quickly. This is Deputy Marshal Frank Rivers from Denver. They rode in this morning asking questions about Samuel Cross. Bo's pulse quickened. A federal marshal, just what he needed, with Cross's documents burning a hole in his jacket. What kind of questions? Marshal Rivers stepped forward, his keen eyes taking in Bo's defensive posture and the obvious signs of recent tension around the cabin. The kind that suggests Deputy Cross's disappearance 20 years ago wasn't as simple as folks around here believed. We've had reports that certain parties have been asking about Cross and this cabin. Parties with connections to activities that concern the federal government. Martha dismounted and moved closer to Bo, her expression worried. After you left yesterday, I got to thinking about that man calling himself Smith. Something about him didn't sit right, so I sent word to Sheriff Crawford. When the marshal here showed up asking about Cross, we put 2 and 2 together. What do you know about Samuel Cross? Rivers asked Bo directly. Bo weighed his options carefully. These people had likely saved his life by arriving when they did. But revealing what he'd found could complicate things beyond his ability to handle. On the other hand, if Cross really had been a federal deputy, then maybe the law was finally on the right side of this mess. Found some of his belongings in the cabin, Bo admitted. Journals, letters. Seems he was more than just a prospector. Rivers nodded grimly. Deputy Cross was working undercover, investigating the Mason gang robbery of 1865, when his reports stopped coming and he couldn't be located. The case was suspended but never officially closed. Recently, Certain information came to light suggesting his investigation had been compromised by parties with their own interest in the stolen gold. What kind of parties? Doc asked. The kind that don't file reports with federal authorities when they recover government property, Rivers replied dryly. We believe Cross discovered the location of the Mason gang's cash, but before he could secure it, he was eliminated by a group that had been tracking his progress. Sheriff Crawford stepped forward. The marshal thinks these same people have been keeping tabs on this area ever since, waiting for the right moment to complete their recovery of the stolen gold. Bo felt the pieces clicking together. Morrison, the old man who was asking about the cabin, he's been working this case for 20 years. Rivers' expression sharpened. Jake Morrison. Yes, we've been trying to locate Mr. Morrison for quite some time. He's wanted for questioning in connection with several cases involving missing federal property. If he's been here recently, it confirms our suspicions about what's really hidden on this mountain. Martha looked between Bo and the marshal, her practical mind working through the implications. So, what you're saying is that Bo here has stumbled into the middle of a 20-year-old federal investigation involving stolen gold and murder. That's about the size of it, Rivers confirmed. The question now is what Deputy Cross discovered before he was killed, and whether any of that information survived. Bo made his decision. Reaching into his jacket, he withdrew Cross's journal, the marshal's correspondence, and the field notes he'd found that morning. Cross kept detailed records. Everything he learned, everything he found, it's all here. Rivers accepted the documents with obvious relief, but his expression grew more concerned as he examined them. After several minutes of reading, he looked up at Bo with something approaching respect. Deputy Cross was thorough. According to this, he not only located the primary cache site, but discovered evidence of a secondary location that the Mason gang used as their main repository. If his calculations are correct, we're talking about a substantial amount of gold, enough to make the recovery worth killing for. How much? Doc asked. Rivers consulted Cross's notes again. The original robbery netted approximately $50,000 in Union gold, plus whatever they took from the bank's civilian accounts. In today's money, we're looking at perhaps $200,000 or more. Sheriff Crawford whistled low. No wonder Morrison's been so persistent. The problem, Rivers continued, is that Cross's final entries suggest he was close to locating the secondary cache when he disappeared. According to this, he had identified the entrance and was planning to conduct a full survey. If Morrison's people killed Cross before he could report his findings, they may still be looking for the final piece of the puzzle. Both thought about the cave system Cross had described, the Spanish marker stones, and the detailed sketches that showed exactly where to look. What if Cross left more than just notes? What if he left a trail that someone else could follow? Rivers studied Bo carefully. Are you suggesting you might be able to complete Cross's investigation? I'm suggesting that those two men who were here this morning aren't going to give up. They know I found something, and they'll be back with more men and fewer scruples about how they get what they want. The marshal nodded slowly. Then we have a choice. We can evacuate you from the area and hope Morrison's people lose interest. Or we can finish what Deputy Cross started and recover that gold before the wrong people get their hands on it. Martha looked around the group, her expression troubled. And if we choose the second option? Rivers met her gaze steadily. Then we're going to need all the help we can get. Because Morrison's had 20 years to plan for this moment, and he's not going to let a federal marshal and a few local lawmen stand between him and a fortune in stolen gold. Bo felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. For the first time in years, he had a chance to be part of something important, something that mattered beyond his own survival. But he also understood that the choice he made in the next few minutes might be the last decision he ever got to make. The group spent the remainder of the morning studying Cross's documents and planning their next move. Rivers spread the field notes and sketches across the cabin's wooden table while the others gathered around. each contributing their knowledge of the local terrain and recent suspicious activities. According to Cross's measurements, Rivers explained, tracing a route on the crude map. The secondary cache is located approximately 3/4 of a mile northeast of here, in what he describes as a limestone cave system with multiple chambers. He indicates the entrance is concealed by what he calls the old Spanish method, 3 marker stones, arranged to point toward a hidden door. Sheriff Crawford studied the sketches with the eye of a man who'd spent years tracking outlaws through difficult country. I know that area. There's a whole network of caves up there, some of them running deep enough that you could hide an army. Problem is, it's also easy to get lost if you don't know what you're doing. Doc Brennan looked troubled. If Cross found this cache 20 years ago, why hasn't anyone recovered it since then? Surely Morrison and his people would have located it by now. That's what's been puzzling me, Rivers admitted. According to Cross's final entry, he was planning to conduct a full survey and recovery on March 21st, 1884. But if he was killed before he could complete that mission, Morrison's people might have eliminated him precisely because they didn't know the exact location of the secondary cache. Bo had been quiet during the discussion, but now he spoke up. What if Cross did complete his survey? What if he found the gold but never got the chance to report it? Martha raised an eyebrow. You mean he might have moved it? Think about it, Bo continued, warming to the idea. Cross knew he was being hunted. His final journal entry shows he was under pressure, maybe desperate. If he found the cache but realized Morrison was closing in, he might have relocated the gold to protect it until he could get word to his superiors. Rivers considered this possibility, rereading Cross's final notes. It would explain why Morrison's people have been searching this area for 20 years without success. They're looking for the original Mason gang cache. But if Cross moved the gold, then it could be anywhere. Sheriff Crawford finished grimly. Not anywhere, Bo corrected. Pulling out Cross's journal and turning to a page he'd studied repeatedly during the night. Cross was methodical about everything. If he moved the gold, he would have documented the new location somehow. The group leaned closer as Bo pointed to a series of seemingly random notations scattered throughout Cross's final week of entries. Numbers, compass bearings, and cryptic references that hadn't made sense when read individually. Look at this, Bo said, excitement growing in his voice. March 18th. Verified secondary location bearing 047 degrees. Distance 1.2 chains from Marker Oak. March 19th. Eagle's Roost visible at 127 degrees, 13 paces to Standing Stone. March 20th. Final coordinates secured. Package relocated to safe harbor until extraction possible. Rivers studied the notations with growing comprehension. He was creating a new map. A coded reference that would mean nothing to Morrison's people, but would allow federal authorities to locate the gold if something happened to him. The question is, Martha said practically, can we decode it? Before anyone could answer, the sound of a rifle shot echoed across the ridge, followed quickly by 2 more. The group froze, then moved as one toward the cabin's windows. In the distance, they could see smoke rising from the direction of the main trail. That's not hunting, Sheriff Crawford said grimly, checking his weapons. Someone's sending a signal. Rivers moved to the window that offered the best view of the approach to the cabin. Or creating a distraction. Martial training teaches you to watch for coordinated attacks. Draw attention in one direction while the real threat comes from another, as if summoned by his words. The crack of breaking branches came from the timber behind the cabin. Too much noise for wildlife, too purposeful for accident. Someone was moving through the forest, and they weren't trying very hard to conceal their approach. How many men does Morrison have? Bo asked, reaching for his rifle. Unknown, Rivers replied, but assume more than we can handle in a straight fight. We need to move. Doc Brennan gathered up Cross's documents, while Martha checked the loads in an old shotgun she'd found among the cabin's supplies. Where to? They'll have the trail back to town covered. Rivers studied Cross's sketches again, making rapid calculations. Up. If Cross was right about the cave system, it might offer us protection and concealment while we figure out our next move. The sound of approaching horses confirmed their fears. Through the trees, they could see at least 4 riders converging on the cabin from different directions. Morrison had finally decided to stop playing games. Now would be good, Sheriff Crawford said tersely. Shouldering his rifle and moving toward the cabin's back window, the group slipped out one by one, using the thick pine forest to mask their movements as they began the climb toward the upper ridges. Bo led, following the same route he'd taken that morning, while Rivers brought up the rear to watch for pursuit. The ascent was harder this time, burdened with equipment and extra people, but the adrenaline of imminent danger drove them upward faster than prudence might have dictated. Behind them, they could hear shouts and the sound of the cabin door being kicked in as Morrison's men discovered their quarry had flown. "They'll track us," Rivers warned as they paused to catch their breath behind a screen of boulders. Morrison's had 20 years to plan for this. "He'll have men who know this country." "Then we'd better find that cave system before they find us," Bo replied, studying Cross's sketches in the fading afternoon light. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. They were now fugitives on the same mountain where Cross had made his final stand, carrying the same documents, pursued by the same enemies. The only difference was that this time, the federal government knew what was happening. Whether that would be enough to change the outcome remained to be seen as they continued climbing toward the limestone, formations that marked the entrance to the cave system. Bo couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking directly into the trap that had claimed Samuel Cross. The difference was that now they knew it was a trap, and maybe, just maybe, that knowledge would be enough to help them survive what Cross had not. The sound of pursuing horses grew closer, echoing off the rocky walls of the canyon above them. Morrison was coming, and this time he wasn't interested in negotiation. The limestone formations rose before them like ancient sentinels, weathered by countless seasons into fantastical shapes that cast long shadows in the afternoon sun. Bo led the group through a maze of natural corridors and chambers, following Cross's sketches while listening for sounds of pursuit behind them. There, Martha pointed to a cluster of 3 stones arranged in what appeared to be a natural triangle. "That has to be the Spanish marker Cross wrote about." Rivers examined the formation carefully, comparing it to Cross's detailed drawings. The stones were each about the size of a man's torso, positioned to form an arrow that pointed directly toward what appeared to be a solid rock face. But as they moved closer, the illusion resolved into reality. A narrow opening, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, concealed by the angle of the approach and the play of shadows across the limestone. Cross was right, Rivers murmured with professional admiration. "You could walk past this entrance 100 times and never see it if you didn't know exactly where to look." The sound of horses and shouting voices drifted up from below, still distant but getting closer. Morrison's men were following their trail with the persistence of wolves on a blood scent. "Do we go in?" Doc asked, eyeing the narrow opening with obvious reluctance. Sheriff Crawford was already moving toward the entrance. "Better than making our stand out here in the open. At least in there we can control the approaches." Bo squeezed through the opening first, followed by the others. The cave beyond was larger than the entrance suggested, opening into a natural chamber perhaps 20 feet across, and high enough that a man could stand upright. Shafts of sunlight filtered down through cracks in the limestone ceiling, providing enough illumination to reveal that they weren't the first people to use this space. Along one wall, someone had built a rough shelter using loose stones and pieces of timber. Near the back of the chamber, Bo found the remnants of old campfires and scattered tools, evidence that Cross had indeed used this location as a base for his final search. "Look at this," Martha called from the far side of the chamber. She was standing beside what appeared to be another opening, this one leading deeper into the mountain. "The cave system extends further back." Rivers joined her, holding one of the torches they'd brought from the cabin. The flickering light revealed a passage that curved away into darkness. its walls marked with more of the mysterious symbols they'd seen carved into trees around the mountain. Cross documented these markings, Rivers said, consulting the field notes. He believed they were left by the Mason gang as navigation aids through the cave system. According to his theory, the gang used these caves not just to hide their treasure, but as an escape route toward the northern passes. Bo studied the symbols, noting their deliberate placement and careful execution. They're not random. Each one is positioned where the passage branches or changes direction. Someone could follow these marks even in complete darkness. The sound of voices outside the cave entrance made them all freeze. Morrison's men had reached the limestone formations and were conducting a systematic search of the area. "Spread out," came Morrison's voice, clear and commanding despite the distance. "They can't have gone far on foot. Check every crevice, every possible hiding spot. And remember, we want Cross's documents intact." Rivers extinguished his torch and motioned for silence. In the sudden darkness, the cave felt smaller, more oppressive. They could hear the searchers moving among the rock formations outside, calling to each other as they explored potential hiding places. "Nothing here," reported a voice that Bo recognized as belonging to Smith. "Keep looking," Morrison replied. "Cross found something in these caves 20 years ago. I'm not leaving until I know what it was." The search continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Finally, the voices began to fade as Morrison's men moved their search to other areas of the ridge. But Bo knew they wouldn't go far. Morrison had been hunting this treasure too long to give up easily. When Rivers finally risked lighting another torch, the group gathered around Cross's field notes to study their options. The cave system offered both opportunity and danger, protection from Morrison's men, but also the risk of becoming trapped if they ventured too deep into the unknown passages. "According to Cross's map," Rivers said quietly, "the original Mason gang cache was located in a chamber approximately 300 yards back along this main passage. He describes it as a natural vault with a single entrance that could be easily defended." "What about the secondary cache?" Bo asked. "The one Cross said contained the majority of the stolen gold." Rivers traced a different route on the sketches. "Here, Cross indicates it's in a separate chamber system, accessible through what he calls the narrow gate. Based on his measurements, it's deeper in the mountain but connected to the main passage system." Doc Brennan looked troubled by the implications. "If we go in there and Morrison seals the entrance, we could be trapped indefinitely. If we stay here and Morrison finds us, we'll be dead," Sheriff Crawford pointed out pragmatically. "At least inside the cave system, we have options." Martha had been examining something she'd found near Cross's old shelter, a wooden box, small enough to fit in a man's saddlebags, secured with an iron lock that had long since rusted through. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was another journal. "This isn't Cross's handwriting," she said, comparing it to the documents they already had. "Someone else was keeping records." Rivers took the journal and examined the first few pages by torchlight. His expression grew grim as he read. "This belongs to Thomas Mason, leader of the gang that robbed the Virginia City Bank. It's a complete record of their escape route and the locations where they cached their stolen goods." The implications hit Bo immediately. Cross didn't just find the treasure locations. He found the gang's own map to their hiding places. "Which means," Rivers concluded, "that everything Cross discovered about the cache locations came directly from the men who hid the gold in the first place. If this journal is accurate, we're not just guessing about where the treasure is hidden. We have the original instructions for finding it." Outside the cave, the sound of returning horses announced that Morrison's search had expanded but not concluded. They were running out of time to make their decision about whether to venture deeper into the cave system or try to escape back down the mountain. As Bo studied Thomas Mason's journal by flickering torchlight, he realized they were holding more than just the key to a lost fortune. They were holding the final pieces of a puzzle that had cost Samuel Cross his life and had kept Jake Morrison searching for 20 years. The question now was whether they could solve that puzzle before Morrison solved the problem of their continued existence. Rivers was deep in Thomas Mason's journal when his expression suddenly changed. The federal marshal's face went pale in the torchlight, and his hands began to shake slightly as he turned the pages. "What is it?" Bo asked, noting the marshal's obvious distress. Rivers looked up at the group, his professional composure cracking for the first time since they'd met him. "We need to get out of here now." "What are you talking about?" Sheriff Crawford demanded. Morrison's men are the least of our problems," Rivers interrupted, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "This journal, it's not just a record of where the Mason gang hid their treasure." Bo moved closer, studying the marshal's face in the flickering light. "What else is it?" Rivers took a shaky breath before answering. "It's a complete record of a Confederate intelligence operation that was never supposed to exist. The Virginia City bank robbery wasn't just about money. It was about funding a secret network of Confederate agents operating in Union territory. Throughout the final years of the war, the implications of this revelation settled over the group like a cold fog." Martha was the first to speak. "You're saying the stolen gold was Confederate intelligence money?" "Worse than that," Rivers replied, turning to a specific page in Mason's journal. "According to this, the Mason gang wasn't just robbing banks for personal profit. They were working under direct orders from Confederate intelligence officers who had established a network of safe houses and weapons caches throughout Colorado territory. The gold they stole was meant to fund ongoing operations against Union forces and civilian targets." Doc Brennan leaned forward, his scholarly mind grasping the historical significance. A Confederate spy network operating in Union territory, funded by stolen federal gold. If this information had come to light during the war, it would have changed everything, Rivers finished. But that's not the worst part. Bo felt a growing sense of dread. "What's the worst part?" Rivers turned to the final entries in Mason's journal, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The network didn't end with the war. According to Thomas Mason's final entries, the Confederate intelligence operation continued after Lee's surrender, funded by hidden caches of gold and operated by former Confederate officers who refused to accept defeat." The cave fell silent, except for the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the deeper passages. Sheriff Crawford was the first to break the silence. "Are you telling us that Samuel Cross stumbled onto evidence of an ongoing Confederate resistance movement?" Rivers nodded grimly. "And that Jake Morrison isn't just a treasure hunter. According to Mason's journal, Morrison is the operational commander of what's left of that Confederate network. He's been searching for Cross's discoveries not just to recover the gold, but to protect the existence of an organization that's been operating in secret for 20 years. Bo felt the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. That's why Cross disappeared. He didn't just find treasure. He uncovered a conspiracy that certain people would kill to keep hidden. "And now we have," Martha said quietly. Rivers closed Mason's journal with hands that trembled slightly. Cross's final report mentioned that he was planning to notify federal authorities about more than just recovered gold. If Morrison's people intercepted that communication, the sound of voices outside the cave entrance cut him off. But these weren't the same voices they'd heard during the earlier search. These were closer, more purposeful, and they were coming from multiple directions. "They found the entrance," Sheriff Crawford whispered. Drawing his weapon, Bo moved to the narrow opening and peered out carefully. What he saw made his blood run cold. Morrison's men had indeed found the cave entrance, but they weren't preparing to enter. Instead, they were setting up what looked like a siege perimeter, with men positioned to cover all possible escape routes from the cave system. "They're not coming in," Bo reported quietly. "They're sealing us in." Rivers understood immediately. "They don't need to capture us alive. They just need to make sure we never leave this mountain with what we've discovered." The sound of heavy objects being moved outside confirmed their fears. Morrison's men were using rocks and timber to block the cave entrance, turning their hiding place into a tomb. "Is there another way out?" Doc asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Rivers consulted Cross's sketches of the cave system. Cross mapped several passages leading deeper into the mountain, but he wasn't sure where they led. Some of them might connect to other entrances, but we could also get lost in there and never find our way out, Martha finished. The sound of Morrison's voice echoed into the cave as the entrance was systematically sealed. Take your time in there, Marshal Rivers. Think about what you've found and what it means. When you're ready to discuss terms for everyone's survival, let us know. Bo turned to stare at Rivers. He knows you're a federal marshal. How is that possible? Rivers' expression was grim. Because Jake Morrison isn't just the operational commander of a Confederate resistance network. According to Mason's journal, he's also been operating as a federal informant for the past 15 years, feeding information to certain parties in Washington who have their own reasons for wanting this conspiracy to remain buried. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with devastating clarity. Sheriff Crawford voiced what they were all thinking. You mean Morrison has been protecting this secret with official backing? Not official, Rivers corrected, but certain influential people in the federal government have apparently decided that revealing the existence of an ongoing Confederate conspiracy would cause more problems than it would solve. Morrison's been allowed to operate freely as long as he keeps the secret contained. Martha looked around the group with growing understanding. And now we're the secret that needs to be contained. The sound of the final stones being moved into place outside the entrance punctuated her words. They were now trapped in a limestone cave, with evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the federal government, pursued by men who had official protection for their actions. There's something else, Rivers said quietly, studying the final pages of Mason's journal. According to this, the network's primary weapons cache is hidden somewhere in this cave system. If Morrison gets his hands on that arsenal, he won't need government protection anymore, Bo finished. The torchlight flickered as air currents shifted through the sealed cave, reminding them that their time was now measured not just in hours, but in the amount of breathable air remaining in their limestone prison. As they gathered Cross's documents and prepared to venture deeper into the unknown passages of the cave system, Bo reflected on the bitter irony of their situation. They had set out to recover stolen Union gold and complete Samuel Cross's mission. Instead, they had uncovered a conspiracy that threatened to rewrite their understanding of the past 20 years of American history. And now, like Cross before them, they faced the very real possibility that their discoveries would die with them in the depths of Widow's Ridge. The deeper passages of the cave system stretched before them like the throat of some ancient beast, disappearing into darkness that their torchlight could barely penetrate. Rivers had rationed their remaining torches carefully. They had perhaps 2 hours of light left, after which they would be navigating by touch alone through limestone corridors that could easily become their tomb. Bo led the way, following the symbols that Thomas Mason had carved into the rock 20 years before Cross had ever set foot on this mountain. The gang leader's journal provided a detailed guide to the cave system, complete with warnings about unstable passages and dead ends that could trap unwary explorers. According to Mason, Rivers called quietly from behind him, the main weapons cache is located in what he calls the Cathedral Chamber, a large natural vault approximately half a mile into the mountain. Cross's notes suggest he found evidence that someone had been there recently, which means Morrison's people may have already located it. The passage they were following gradually widened as they moved deeper into the mountain, opening into a series of connected chambers that showed clear signs of long-term human occupation. They found the remains of sleeping areas, supply caches, and even a crude but effective ventilation system that had been carved to draw fresh air from hidden surface openings. This wasn't just a hiding place, Martha observed, examining the careful stonework around one of the chambers. Someone built this to be a permanent installation. Doc Brennan nodded, his historian's eye taking in the details of the construction. A command post, If Morrison's network really has been operating for 20 years, they would need a secure base of operations. Somewhere they could plan and coordinate without fear of discovery. Sheriff Crawford had been studying the passages that branched off from their route, noting how they formed a defensive network that would allow defenders to retreat deeper into the mountain while maintaining communication with the surface. Whoever designed this knew what they were doing. This whole cave system has been turned into a fortress, the sound of distant voices echoing through the passages behind them confirmed that Morrison's men had found a way into the cave system despite the blocked entrance. They were being pursued through corridors that their enemies knew far better than they did. How much further to the cathedral chamber? Bo asked, consulting Mason's journal by the flickering torchlight. Rivers checked Cross's measurements against the gang leader's original map. If we're following the correct route, it should be just ahead. But Mason's journal includes several warnings about this section. Apparently, the chamber is protected by both natural hazards and artificial defenses. They soon discovered what Mason meant. The passage ahead narrowed dramatically before opening into a vast natural cathedral carved from solid limestone by millions of years of flowing water. The chamber was perhaps 100 feet across and twice as high, with stone formations that resembled the pillars and arches of a Gothic cathedral. But what captured their attention immediately was evidence of extensive human modification. Someone had carved steps into the natural rock formations, creating multiple levels and platforms throughout the chamber. Supply caches had been built into natural alcoves, and a sophisticated system of ropes and pulleys had been installed to move heavy equipment between the different levels. At the far end of the chamber, partially concealed behind a natural stone formation, they could see the entrance to what appeared to be an armory. Cross was right, Rivers breathed, studying the scene with professional appreciation. This isn't just a weapons cache, it's a complete military installation, hidden in the heart of a mountain. Bo moved carefully down the carved steps toward the chamber floor, noting how the natural acoustics of the space would amplify any sound. They would have to move quietly if they hoped to avoid detection by Morrison's pursuing forces. The armory proved to contain exactly what Mason's journal had promised: rifles, ammunition, explosives, and supplies sufficient to equip a small army. But more disturbing were the maps and documents they found stored in waterproof containers throughout the chamber. These weren't historical records. They were current intelligence reports, surveillance notes, and operational plans that confirmed Rivers's worst fears about the scope of Morrison's network. "Look at this," Martha whispered, holding up a folder of documents dated within the past 6 months. They've been monitoring federal law enforcement activities throughout Colorado Territory, tracking marshal movements, intercepting telegraph communications. Sheriff Crawford examined a collection of weapons that showed recent use and careful maintenance. This isn't some historical curiosity. This is an active military operation, and they've been preparing for something big. Rivers found the most disturbing evidence in a locked strongbox that had been hidden behind the main weapons rack. Inside were detailed plans for what appeared to be a coordinated series of attacks on federal facilities throughout the territory, including supply depots, communication lines, and transportation networks. "They're planning a rebellion," he said quietly, studying the operational documents with growing horror. Not just resistance or sabotage, an actual military campaign designed to destabilize federal authority throughout the region. Bo felt a cold dread settling in his stomach as he realized the implications. "And we're the only people who know about it, which is why Morrison can't let us leave this mountain alive," Doc said grimly. "If word of this reaches Washington," the sound of approaching footsteps echoing through the passages leading to the cathedral chamber cut him off. Morrison's men had found their trail and were closing in rapidly. "How many ways out of here?" Sheriff Crawford asked, checking his weapons and ammunition. Rivers consulted both Mason's journal and Cross's maps, his expression growing more troubled as he compared the two sources. "According to Mason, there are 3 passages leading out of this chamber. But Cross's notes suggest that two of them have been deliberately blocked since Mason's time. Blocked by whom? By Morrison's people, most likely. They've been using this place as their base of operations. They wouldn't want multiple, uncontrolled access points. Martha had been examining the rope and pulley system that connected the different levels of the chamber. What about going up instead of out? Those ropes lead to openings in the upper levels that might connect to surface ventilation shafts. Bo studied the natural formations above them, noting how the limestone had been carved by water into a complex network of connected passages. It's possible. But if we get trapped up there, we're already trapped down here, Sheriff Crawford pointed out. At least up there we might have a chance. The decision was made for them when the first of Morrison's men appeared at the entrance to the cathedral chamber. The sound of rifle fire echoed through the vast space as the lawmen took cover behind the natural stone formations while their pursuers established positions at the chamber's main entrance. "Morrison," Rivers called out, his voice carrying clearly in the cathedral acoustics. "This is Deputy Marshal Frank Rivers. You're under arrest for conspiracy against the United States government." Morrison's laughter echoed back from the entrance. "Marshal Rivers, you're a practical man. Look around you. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a place where your bodies will never be found. I'm prepared to offer you one final opportunity to discuss reasonable terms for everyone's survival." "What terms?" Rivers replied, though Bo could see he was using the conversation to position his people for a better defensive position. "Simple. You leave Cross's documents and everything you've discovered here in the chamber. You walk away from this mountain and forget everything you've seen. In return, you live to see another sunrise." Rivers glanced at the federal conspiracy documents they'd found in the armory, then at his companions. The weight of what they'd discovered, the ongoing Confederate network, the planned rebellion, the government officials who'd been protecting Morrison's operations, was almost too much for one man to carry. "And if we refuse?" Rivers called back. "Then you join Samuel Cross in a grave that no one will ever find," Morrison replied. "You have 5 minutes to decide, Marshal. After that, my men start using those explosives you found in the armory to bring down enough of this chamber to ensure your silence is permanent." As the echoes of Morrison's ultimatum faded into the limestone cathedral, Bo realized they were facing the same choice that had confronted Samuel Cross 20 years earlier. The difference was that now they knew exactly what they were choosing between: their lives or the survival of the Union that so many had died to preserve. Rivers looked at his pocket watch, then at each member of their small group. 3 minutes had passed since Morrison's ultimatum, leaving them 2 minutes to make a decision that would determine not just their own fate, but potentially the fate of the federal government's authority throughout the territory. "I need to know what each of you is thinking," Rivers said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the sound of Morrison's men positioning themselves at the chamber entrance. "This isn't just about us anymore. If Morrison's rebellion succeeds, it could spark a wider Confederate resurgence that the country might not survive." Sheriff Crawford checked his rifle and counted his remaining ammunition. "I took an oath to uphold federal law. Don't see how that changes just because I'm about to die doing it." Martha nodded grimly. "My husband died at Gettysburg fighting to preserve the Union. I'll not see his sacrifice wasted because we were too frightened to finish what he started, Doc." Brennan surprised them all by pulling an old Navy Colt from beneath his coat. "I may be a physician, but I was also a Union surgeon during the war. I've seen what happens when good men fail to act against evil." All eyes turned to Bo, the man who had started this journey with nothing but $20 and a desperate need for shelter, now held the weight of a nation's future in his weathered hands. "Samuel Ross died trying to do the right thing," Bo said slowly. "If we walk away now, his death meant nothing. If we die here, at least we die trying to finish his mission." Rivers nodded, feeling a surge of pride in these ordinary people who had chosen extraordinary courage when faced with an impossible choice. "Then we make our stand here. But we don't just die. We make sure Morrison's conspiracy dies with us." "How?" Martha asked. Even if we kill Morrison and his men, his network extends far beyond this mountain. Rivers pulled out the operational documents they'd found in the armory. These papers contain names, locations, communication codes, everything federal authorities would need to roll up Morrison's entire network. But only if someone gets this information to Washington. Bo studied the rope and pulley system that led to the upper levels of the chamber. The ventilation shafts Martha mentioned, they have to connect to the surface somewhere. If one of us could get through, I'll go, Doc Brennan said immediately. I'm the oldest, and the climb will be hardest on me. If anyone's going to die in this cave, better it be me than someone who might have 40 more years to live. No, Rivers said firmly. I'm the federal officer. This is my responsibility. And I'm the one who bought the damn cabin in the first place, Bo interrupted. Besides, I've spent my whole life climbing around mountains and caves. If anyone can make it through those shafts, it's me. Before anyone could argue further, Morrison's voice echoed through the chamber again. Time's up, Marshal. What's your decision? Rivers took a deep breath and made the choice that would define the final chapter of this 20-year conspiracy. Our decision is the same one Samuel Cross made Morrison. We choose duty over survival. The response was immediate. Rifle fire erupted from the chamber entrance as Morrison's men opened up on their positions behind the stone formations. But the sound that followed the gunfire was far more ominous, the distinctive hiss of a lit fuse. Explosives, Sheriff Crawford shouted. They're going to bring down the entrance. Rivers grabbed the operational documents and thrust them into Bo's hands. Go now! Get to those upper passages before they seal us in. Bo took the papers and began climbing the rope system toward the upper levels of the chamber. His years of ranch work serving him well as he pulled himself hand over hand toward the limestone passages that might lead to freedom. Behind him, the others had taken defensive positions and were returning fire at Morrison's men, buying him precious seconds to reach the upper passages. The explosion, when it came, was deafening in the confined space of the cathedral chamber. The blast brought down tons of limestone, sealing the main entrance and trapping Morrison's men inside, along with the federal agents they'd been trying to eliminate. But it also sent shockwaves through the entire cave system, causing smaller passages to collapse and filling the air with choking dust. Bo had just reached the entrance to what appeared to be a ventilation shaft when the explosion hit. The shockwave knocked him from the rope system, sending him tumbling back toward the chamber floor. He landed hard on a natural stone ledge, the operational documents scattering around him in the dust-filled darkness. For a moment, the chamber was silent except for the sound of settling rock and the groans of men injured in the blast. Then Morrison's voice cut through the dust and darkness. Well, Marshal Rivers, it appears we're all going to die together after all. But at least my men on the surface will ensure that my network's operations continue. Your sacrifice will be noted in history, but it will not change the ultimate outcome. As Bo struggled to gather the scattered documents in the choking darkness, he realized that Morrison was right about one thing. They were all trapped now. The question was whether anyone would survive long enough to ensure that the conspiracy died with them in the depths of Widow's Ridge. The dust began to settle in the cathedral chamber, revealing the full extent of their predicament. The main entrance was completely blocked by tons of fallen limestone, but the explosion had also created new openings in the chamber walls where the shock waves had cracked the ancient rock. Weak shafts of sunlight filtered down through these fissures, providing just enough light to see the grim scene below. Morrison emerged from behind a fallen stone pillar, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, but otherwise unharmed. 3 of his men were still alive, though one appeared to have a broken arm from falling debris. On the federal side, Rivers had taken a bullet in the shoulder during the initial exchange. Sheriff Crawford was limping from a twisted ankle, and Martha was helping Doc Brennan, who had been knocked unconscious by the blast. It seems we have a stalemate. Marshal, Morrison called out, his voice carrying easily in the damaged acoustics of the chamber. We're all trapped, but I still have more men and better weapons. I propose we discuss terms. Rivers pressed a bandana against his wounded shoulder, his face pale but determined. "The only terms I'm interested in are your unconditional surrender, Morrison. You're finished, and you know it." Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Am I? Even if you somehow manage to kill me and my men, even if you survive this cave-in and make it back to civilization, what then? Do you really think the people who've been protecting my operations for 15 years will simply allow you to expose them?" From his position on the stone ledge above, Bo could see both groups clearly. The operational documents were scattered around him, some damaged by the blast, but most still readable. He also noticed something that neither Morrison nor Rivers had seen yet. The explosion had opened a passage in the upper levels that led toward what appeared to be natural sunlight. "You're talking about federal officials," Rivers replied. "Men who took oaths to defend the Constitution. I'm talking about practical men who understand that sometimes the greater good requires uncomfortable compromises," Morrison corrected. "The Confederate network I've been running has provided valuable intelligence on everything from Mexican border incursions to Indian uprising plans. We've prevented more federal casualties than we've caused," Sheriff Crawford spat in disgust. "By operating outside the law and planning armed rebellion against the government you claim to be helping. The rebellion you discovered is a contingency plan. Nothing more," Morrison said smoothly. "Insurance against the possibility that our usefulness to certain parties in Washington might come to an end, which it appears is exactly what's happening now." Bo began moving carefully along the ledge, gathering the scattered documents while staying out of sight of the men below. As he collected the papers, he noticed that one folder contained something he hadn't seen before: correspondence between Morrison and officials in Washington that detailed the exact nature of their arrangement. "Even if you kill us all," Rivers continued, "someone will eventually investigate our disappearance. The truth will come out, will it?" Morrison asked. "Marshal Rivers, you're here without official authorization, investigating a case that was officially closed 20 years ago. Sheriff Crawford and the others are local officials with no federal standing. Who's going to investigate the disappearance of people who were never supposed to be here in the first place?" The cold logic of Morrison's position sent a chill through Bo. The man was right. They had stumbled into this conspiracy by accident, and their disappearance could easily be explained away by the same officials who had been protecting Morrison's operations. But as Bo examined the correspondence he'd found, he realized Morrison had made one crucial mistake. The letters were signed by specific officials in Washington, complete with dates and official seals. More importantly, they detailed payments and support that went far beyond simple intelligence cooperation. They described a shadow organization operating within the federal government itself. "There's something you should know about your friends in Washington," Bo called down from the ledge, his voice carrying clearly in the chamber. "They've been very thorough in documenting their relationship with your network." Morrison spun around, raising his rifle toward Bo's position. "Stoddard! I thought you were dead." "Not yet," Bo replied, holding up the folder of correspondence. "But I'm thinking your friends in Washington might be soon. These letters detail payments, operations, and cover-ups that go all the way to the top levels of the federal bureaucracy. If this information reaches the press or honest federal investigators, it won't just expose your network. It'll bring down everyone who's been protecting you." Morrison's face went white as he realized what Bo was holding. "Those documents are classified. Possessing them is treason, maybe," Bo acknowledged. "But using them to expose a conspiracy against the United States government, that's patriotism." Rivers understood immediately. "Bo, can you get out through that passage?" Bo looked toward the opening the explosion had created, judging the distance and the climb required. "I think so, but I'll need someone to cover my retreat." Morrison was already moving, ordering his men to focus their fire on Bo's position. But Sheriff Crawford and the others were ready, laying down covering fire that forced Morrison's group to take shelter behind the fallen stones. As Bo began climbing toward the passage that might lead to freedom, He carried with him not just evidence of Morrison's conspiracy, but proof of a corruption that reached into the highest levels of the federal government. The question now was whether he could escape the mountain alive and find someone in Washington who could be trusted with the truth. 6 months later, Bo Stoddard sat on the porch of his new cabin, watching the sun set over a valley that had finally found peace. The cabin was modest but comfortable, built with money the federal government had quietly provided in recognition of services rendered to the nation. More importantly, it was his, bought and paid for with honest work rather than desperate hope. The newspapers had called it the Morrison conspiracy, though they had only reported a fraction of the truth. The official story spoke of a rogue Confederate network that had been operating without government knowledge, finally exposed and dismantled by the heroic actions of federal law enforcement. There was no mention of the shadow organization within the government itself, no reference to the high-ranking officials, who had been quietly reassigned or encouraged to retire. Early Marshal Rivers had recovered from his wounds and received a commendation for his work in exposing the conspiracy. He visited Bo regularly, partly to check on his welfare and partly to ensure that certain sensitive details of their discovery never found their way into public discussion. The understanding between them was clear. Some truths were too dangerous for a nation still healing from civil war. Sheriff Crawford had been elected to the territorial legislature on a platform of honest government and federal cooperation. Martha Henley had used her newfound prominence to expand her general store into a small empire of businesses that served the growing population of Cedar Falls. Doc Brennan had written a carefully sanitized account of their adventure for a medical journal, focusing on the challenges of treating injuries in confined spaces while avoiding any mention of Confederate conspiracies or government corruption. The passage Bo had escaped through that day in the cathedral chamber had indeed led to the surface, emerging from a concealed opening more than a mile from the original cave entrance. He had made his way to Cedar Falls through a landscape that seemed transformed by his experience, carrying documents that would ultimately lead to the quiet dismantling of Morrison's entire network. Morrison himself had not survived the cave-in. Official reports stated that he and his remaining men had been killed when unstable portions of the cave system collapsed, trapping them in passages that rescue teams could never safely reach. The truth was more complex. Rivers and his companions had eventually found another way out of the cathedral chamber, but Morrison had chosen to make a final stand rather than surrender to federal justice. The stolen Union gold had finally been recovered, though not from the locations described in either Cross's journals or Mason's maps. Morrison's network had moved it years earlier, converting it into more practical assets that funded their operations throughout the territory. The federal government had recovered most of the value, though certain expenditures were quietly written off as the cost of maintaining national security. Bo often thought about Samuel Cross during those quiet evenings on his porch. The deputy marshal's mission had finally been completed 20 years after his death by a desperate man who had bought a cabin site unseen and stumbled into history. There was a certain justice in that, a sense that the universe sometimes conspired to ensure that good men's sacrifices were not made in vain. The official record stated that Deputy Cross had died in a riding accident while pursuing leads in the Mason gang investigation. His body had never been found, which was listed as unfortunate but not uncommon in the dangerous terrain of the Colorado Territory. The truth that he had been murdered by Confederate agents while attempting to expose a conspiracy that reached into the federal government remained sealed in files that would not be opened for decades. If ever Bo had kept one memento from his adventure, Cross's original journal, the leather-bound record of a methodical man's patient search for justice. Marshal Rivers had allowed him to retain it after the sensitive portions had been removed for official use. On quiet evenings, Bo would read Cross's observations about the territory, His careful notes about weather and terrain, his professional assessment of the people he encountered during his investigation. There was wisdom in those pages, the accumulated knowledge of a man who had understood that justice was often a matter of patience and persistence rather than dramatic confrontation. Cross had died before he could complete his mission, but his careful documentation had made it possible for others to finish what he had started. The irony was not lost on Bo that he had begun this journey looking for shelter and ended it helping to preserve the union that had given him the freedom to seek that shelter in the first place. $20 spent in desperation had led to discoveries that affected the course of American history, though the public would never know the full extent of what had been at stake on Widow's Ridge. As the stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, Bo reflected on the choices that had brought him to this place. He could have walked away when Morrison first offered him money to forget what he had found. He could have fled when the shooting started in the cathedral chamber. He could have kept quiet about the government corruption he had discovered, accepting official gratitude in exchange for official silence. Instead, he had chosen to honor the memory of a man he had never met, completing a mission that had begun 2 decades before he arrived on this mountain. In doing so, he had discovered something more valuable than stolen gold, the knowledge that ordinary people could still make a difference when they chose duty over safety, truth over comfort. The cabin was quiet now, filled with the peaceful silence of a man who had found his place in the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight Bo Stoddard could rest easy, knowing that Samuel Cross's long vigil was finally over, and that justice, though delayed, had finally been served. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, carrying passengers and cargo toward destinations unknown. The sound reminded Bo that the world beyond his mountain was still turning, still changing, still offering opportunities for those brave enough to seize them. But for now, this cabin, this valley, this hard-won peace was enough. Sometimes a man's greatest treasure was simply the knowledge that he had done the right thing when it mattered most.